Hello and welcome to The Gaggle, where we challenge and, if necessary, destroy media narratives. On this edition of the program, we talk about Lebanon, what's going on domestically and internationally. And I'm so thrilled to have with us Joshua Landis. He's head of Middle East Studies at the University of Oklahoma. And as usual, George Szamuely is joining me. He is an author, commentator, and one of the founding members of this channel. Joshua, where do you begin in talking about Lebanon right now? In the best of times, it's a precarious place. But after this horrific blast, and looking at the political situation there, if there's even another election, another government, it's pretty much going to be the same political forces in power here. It seems like such a deadlock, and there seems to be so few real options on how to move forward. And we have to highlight the scourge of corruption that has been that is at the very core of what's going on in Lebanon. You've been on Crosstalk a number of times talking about it. Where do we stand right now for Lebanon? Go ahead.
Well, it's really a manifestation of this larger disease that spreads from Iraq right across the entire Levant region, and that is sectarianism. Yeah. And the distrust amongst fellow countrymen, because they see the world through their community often. Now, Lebanon has been trying to break out of that for some time. There is a large middle class that is very critical of the sectarian system, of the corruption that it brings. And this explosion really has brought that to the front. But I don't know, it's the explosion is what we focus on, but really it's the collapse of the banking system that has, I think, really infuriated Lebanese, because it stole their money right out of their pockets. And the country, the elite, has been running a Ponzi scheme for the last 15 years in order to stabilize the currency. And we could say that there were good intentions behind it at first, which was to stabilize the currency after a terrible civil war. But what happened is that Lebanon had to get more and more dollars in order to keep the currency stable. And to do that, it set up these dollar-denominated accounts and then began to raise the interest rate in order to attract money to them. And eventually they were offering 12, 13% on dollar-denominated accounts, which nobody could get anywhere else. So, of course, all Lebanese in the Mahjar in outside of the country, as well as Syrians, my brother-in-law, other family members, had their entire life savings in these Lebanese accounts because they were trying to protect themselves from the Syrian civil war. Then, poof, overnight, they just evaporated as the Ponzi scheme collapsed. And everybody said, oh, the country is no longer solvent. And then they began to want to withdraw their accounts, and they discovered there is no money there. And we don't know quite how many, tens of billions of dollars, perhaps $100 billion, has disappeared. And that's right out of the pockets of all these Lebanese. And that's the underground, that's what's really infuriated people. Of course, the explosion gave everybody a cause to rally around, but it's small beer compared to this terrible collapse into poverty.
It's really interesting. You started your answer about how everyone sees everything through the prism of their own community or their own sect, but with this Ponzi scheme that you just mentioned, that hit everyone simultaneously in an equal measure here. George, I find Lebanese politics fascinating because of the way of its political system of checks and balances for the different groups. And I was watching Aaron Mate on his program Pushback. He had a very, very interesting guest, an academic from Beirut, and she was sharply critical of the sectarian arrangement that they have. But if I had been Aaron Mate asking the question, I would have said, and I would agree with criticisms of it, but I would have asked also, kind of to turn it around, is that the system came into being to keep the peace. That was why they have it, and I think that's really the crux of the problem here, is that you have something that keeps the peace, but it doesn't necessarily bring prosperity to the vast swaths of society, because we have these typical families, long-standing, that even there is a crisis, they are left virtually unharmed. So they're really stuck between a rock and a hard place here, George.
Yes, that's absolutely right. And this power sharing arrangement really has been prevalent in Lebanon ever since it acquired independence in 1943. Exactly the same thing with the president is a Sunni, I think the prime minister is a Sunni, the president is a Maronite Christian, the speaker is a Shia, and yeah, the whole point of this arrangement is to maintain the peace so that they don't kill one another. But of course, this enables families essentially to become entrenched. And so, the sons of the previous leader acquire the position of their fathers, and then their sons in turn acquire the positions of their fathers. And so it just simply goes on. The same few families divide up the goods.
Yeah, so one family has the telecoms, another family has the cement, the other family has the port here. Joshua, how do you break out of that? Because we'll talk in our second edition of talking about Lebanon international perspectives on Lebanon. But this is a glaring, obvious problem inside of Lebanon, and this blast should be a catalyst to really either say we're going to be a state or a failed state, because I think that's the choice that Lebanon is facing right now.
It is the choice. And if any country can do it in the Middle East, perhaps it is Lebanon. But no one is holding their breath, because unfortunately the sectarian differences and accusations and counter accusations have become worse over the last 20 years. And we see that in Syria, where many Syrians before this uprising would have said, we get along at some level. Today, you can't pretend that that's the case. And the same thing in Iraq. It set off this scramble amongst different sectarian groups, different ethnic groups for control. And the fear of every group is if they relinquish power, they're going to be ethnically cleansed. And they all look back at the Armenians or the Jews or other groups that have been ethnically cleansed.
But Joshua, if you let me interrupt you for a second here. I hear that all the time, but is that true? Is that true? That's an excuse not to reform? I'm sorry.
It is an excuse not to reform, and I think it's the largest excuse, because ultimately, in order to reform, the Lebanese are going to have to put down their quotas and give up their quotas, and all believe that they're going to get a bigger hunk of the pie, that the pie will grow, let's say, if they all trust each other. And that is the hardest thing to do. Look at the Shiites in the south, the Hezbollah, who have arms. They're being asked by the rest of Lebanese, turn away from Iran, give up your arms, join the rest of Lebanon as a regular party, and everything will be better. But they turn around to the country and they say, look, during the Civil War, everybody was used to abusing us. We were the dirt poor farmers in the south who had nothing. Then when Israel occupied us, the Lebanese army was incompetent and they didn't lift a finger. In fact, the Christians cooperated with the Israelis against us. And the Palestinians had occupied us, and they can begin to point the finger and say, nobody lifted a finger to help us. The only reason that we're in power today is because we got arms and we took care of ourselves first. And that's the difficulty. How do you convince the Shiites to give up their arms? And that's not just the Shiites, it's the Christians. The Christians have 50% of the seats in parliament. They're 1/3 of the population. It's a crazy situation, but they feel like, oh, we're not going to give up that. We're the only Christian country in the entire Middle East. And, if the Muslims don't like it, they should go to one of the other countries. That's what they say. We have to protect ourselves because the Christians are being driven out of the Middle East. We see that in Iraq, Palestine, Syria. We're hardly left. So each one has a narrative of victimization that is very powerful.
And very real. But George, see, we're in a moment right now, and maybe this is being too idealistic, but to break the deadlock, every single sect is going to have to say, what's more important, my identity or my citizenship? And this could be this catalyst here, and it will take bravery. It will take inner strength, because Lebanon is facing an existential threat to its existence, okay? Because it has all of the ingredients to be a successful place. I've been there. I love that place. It's an amazing place. But they're staring into the abyss. And if some hard questions like what we've just heard can't be answered, then not only is it going to be a problem for Lebanon, but it will have a cascade effect throughout the Middle East. This is an amazing point in time for this country's history.
No, it is. Everybody who's been to Lebanon has fallen in love with the country because in many ways, it's the best aspects of Star Wars barroom scene where you have two of everything. It's the Noah's Ark of the Middle East. And all those groups that have been kicked out of other countries have congregated in Lebanon, and they get along, and they have fun, and they brought the best, their food, their music,
the food. The food. It's absolutely.
And I grew up in Beirut till I was 10, and then I went back to teach there for several years at the International College in the middle of the Civil War, and I've been very connected to Lebanon ever since, and it's painful to see this sort of acrimony, and to a large extent, the Lebanese have been extraordinary. There's been almost no violence or very little violence up to now, and obviously avoiding that violence is key. Because once countries tip into the violence, as we saw in Syria, it's all over. Then you cannot reassure anybody that they're going to be okay.
One would have to hope, George, one would have to hope that, again, eyeing the other communities and suspicions here. I mean, Lebanon had a horrific civil war, and across the border where you have an international proxy civil war that was completely generated from the outside. Okay, this is a point where, is this a learning point? Is this a learning experience? Because like I said, I mean, it's to be or not to be. And Lebanon is a very important country, and it could, under certain circumstances, actually be the model that we all would like it to be. Go ahead, George.
Yes, no, that's right. But I think that given what Joshua was pointing out about the communities having a very legitimate fear of ethnic cleansing, of being exterminated, that isn't going to disappear, at least until the civil war in Syria comes to an end. Because the communities look and see what's going on in Syria, and they will say, no, we don't want that. We don't want ISIS here. We don't want this kind of any kind of horrific, this fanatical Islamism here. So, if you expect people to make sacrifices, then they have to feel safe. And so long as they see what's going on in Syria, and then of course they've seen what happened in Iraq, I don't see any reason for them to give it their position up, because I think they really do have legitimate grounds for believing that they are under threat.
And you're right, George. And if I can jump in here, one is seeing a distressing sort of propensity on the part of the Lebanese, which is to look to the international community.
That's where we're going to go. Yeah.
And we've seen that with the Macron visit first, where he was, adulation was extraordinary because everybody was looking for salvation. They don't believe that their own politicians are going to deliver it. So they turned to the France figure who's, going to somehow come up with a new national pact, as he even mentioned at one point. But then he said, I'm not going to give big aid because we cannot give real aid until Lebanon has reformed. Now, nobody expects the ruling class to come up with this auto-reformation. So then he immediately called Iran, and he agreed, and he came out and said there has to be a government of national unity.
Okay. Now, Joshua, I'm going to jump in here, and we're going to go to a short break, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on Lebanon.
Excellent.